Turn that valve back on right now, or I'll have you arrested on the spot.
Karen's face was scarlet, veins popping in her neck, both hands shaking as she jabbed a finger at me. I didn't even look up. My hands stayed locked on the old iron wheel.
Ma'am, this is the main valve on my property. I'm fixing a leak.
I don't care about your damn leak.
She snarled.
60 families have no water to cook, no water to flush, no water for their kids. The police are already on their way, Mr. Sanders. You turn it back on before they step out of that car.
She spun toward the two people behind her and let out a sharp, mocking laugh.
You hear this guy? Thinks his little rundown ranch is some kind of kingdom.
I slowly turned the wheel another quarter turn. The last of the water pressure died with a low metallic groan. What Karen didn't know, that main line had never belonged to the HOA. It had been mine the entire time. And she was about to find out exactly why. My name is Walter Sanders. I'm 68 years old, and I've lived on this 5-acre lot on the edge of Millbrook Estates for over 30 years. Before the HOA existed, before the subdivision even had a name. Back when this was just open land and I was a young plumber with dirt under his nails and a dream of owning something that was truly mine. I built this ranch house with my own hands, board by board, over 2 summers. My late wife Carol planted the oak tree by the porch the same week we moved in. She used to say that tree would outlive us both. She was right about that, at least. Carol passed 4 years ago, and since then this house and this land are pretty much all I have left of the life we built together. Every morning I still walk the property line before breakfast. Habit, mostly. I check the fence posts, the drainage ditch, the old tool shed door that never quite latches right. Small things. But Carol used to say a man who takes care of the little things never gets blindsided by the big ones. I've tried to live by that every day since she's been gone. The water line running under my property isn't just pipe and steel to me. I laid every foot of it myself back in 1998, long before Millbrook Estates broke ground next door. County records show the easement that permits my name on every document filed and stamped at the recorder's office downtown. I remember digging that trench in July heat so brutal, I had to stop every 20 minutes just to keep from passing out. Carol brought me lemonade every hour on the hour and told me I was building something that would matter someday. When the developers built Millbrook a few years later, they came to me asking for a favor. Just a temporary tap into my line, they said, until their own municipal connection was finished. I said yes because that's the kind of man I am. I don't turn away a neighbor in need. What I didn't expect was that temporary would stretch into 22 years with nobody from the HOA ever bothering to build their own line, or even acknowledging that the pipe under their streets wasn't theirs to control. I never made a fuss about it. I let it go because Carol always said peace was worth more than principle most days. But principle matters when your legacy is on the line, and lately, it feels like everyone around here has forgotten whose land this pipe actually sits on. 2 weeks ago, I noticed a damp patch spreading across my back field, right where the old line runs. I knelt down and pressed my palm into the mud and felt it cold and rising. I dug down and found what I feared, a hairline crack in 30-year-old iron water seeping into the soil, slowly rotting the pipe from the inside. If I didn't shut the main valve and get it patched, I'd lose the whole line. Worse, that slow leak could undermine my foundation, and repairs on a job like that would run me thousands. I don't have. That's the stake for me. This land is my retirement, my legacy, the last piece of Carol I still get to walk through every morning. If that pipe fails completely, I can't afford to fix it, and if the county condemns the property because of unstable ground, I lose everything I've spent my whole life building. So on a quiet Tuesday morning, I did what any responsible landowner would do. I typed up a notice, printed 3 copies, and posted one at the shared gate 3 days in advance, the way I always have. I checked the date twice, smoothed the tape down with my thumb so the wind wouldn't tear it loose, and made sure nobody could say they hadn't been warned. I didn't expect anyone to actually read it, honestly. Nobody ever does. But I figured I'd done my part, followed the same courtesy I've followed for over 2 decades, and that would be the end of it. I should have known better. Because 2 days later, when I finally turned that valve, my phone was already buzzing against the kitchen counter. And somewhere in that gated community full of manicured lawns and folding chairs at HOA meetings, a woman named Karen Whitfield was about to decide that a fight over water pressure was a fight worth losing her composure over. I had no idea how far she'd take it, or how much she'd come to regret not asking one simple question first, whose name was actually on that pipe. The knock on my door came harder than it needed to. 3 sharp raps, then a 4th for good measure. I set down my coffee, wiped my hands on my jeans, and opened it to find Karen Whitfield standing on my porch, arms crossed, flanked by 2 other HOA board members I recognized from the community newsletter photos, but had never actually met in person. "Mr. Sanders," her voice was clipped, controlled, in a way that told me she'd rehearsed this on the drive over. "We have a serious problem. The water's been out since 6 this morning." "I posted a notice," I said, 3 days ago at the gate, repairs to the main line." Karen's jaw tightened. "I didn't see any notice." "It's been there since Saturday, laminated taped at eye level right where everyone parks for the mail." "Well, I didn't see it," she snapped, "and neither did 60 other families, who are currently sitting in homes with dry taps. Do you understand what that means? No water to cook, no water to flush a toilet, people with babies, Mr. Sanders, people with elderly parents on machines that need clean water just to function properly." I kept my voice level, my hand resting on the doorframe. "Ma'am, I understand the inconvenience, but that line runs under my property, and it needed emergency repair. I can have it patched by tomorrow evening if nobody interferes with my work." Interferes. She let out a short, humorless laugh, glancing back at her board members as if inviting them to share the joke. "This is Millbrook Estates infrastructure. You don't get to unilaterally decide to shut off water to an entire neighborhood because you feel like digging a hole in your yard." That was the moment the boundary got crossed, plain and simple. I'd spent 22 years letting people forget the truth about that pipe, and here was Karen standing on my porch telling me I had no right to control water infrastructure, sitting entirely on land I owned, repairing a leak that threatened my own foundation. "With respect," I said, "that line isn't Millbrook infrastructure. It's mine. It's always been mine." Karen blinked, caught off guard, for half a second, before her composure snapped back into place. "That's not what our records show." "Then your records are wrong." One of the board members beside her, a younger man in a golf polo, cleared his throat and stepped forward slightly. "Mr. Sanders, regardless of the history here, the HOA bylaws require 30 days written notice for any planned utility interruption affecting common services submitted to the board for approval in advance. There's no bylaw that governs a private line on private property," I said, keeping my tone even. "I gave courtesy notice. I wasn't required to give anything at all." Karen's face flushed a deeper shade of red. "You listen to me. I've already had 4 residents call the county emergency line. I've had 2 more threatening to sue the HOA for damages. This is now a liability issue, and if you don't restore water immediately, I will have no choice but to escalate this." I felt something settle in my chest, quiet and steady. The kind of calm that comes right before a storm you already know you can weather. Escalate however you need to. But I'm not restoring water until that pipe is safely repaired. I won't risk my foundation or a burst line flooding my field just because it's inconvenient for people who've been drawing water off my property for free for over 2 decades. Karen's mouth opened, then closed. For just a moment, something flickered behind her eyes, something that almost looked like doubt. Almost. Then it hardened right back into fury. "We'll see about that," she said, turning sharply on her heel. "I'm calling the police. Obstruction of essential services is a real thing, Mr. Sanders, and you're about to find that out the hard way." She stormed off my porch, her heels clicking against the walkway, her 2 board members trailing behind her while she was already dialing before she'd even reached her car. I stood in the doorway and watched her go, feeling the old iron valve wheel still cool against my palm from that morning. She had no idea what she'd just started. Somewhere in a filing cabinet inside my house sat a folder Carol used to call the proof, documents I hadn't touched in years because I didn't wait around for the police to show up. I went straight to the back field, pulled on my work gloves and started assessing the damage myself. The crack in the pipe was worse than I'd first thought. A jagged split running nearly 4 inches along the seam. water still weeping slowly into the mud, even with the valve shut. I'd need new fittings, a length of replacement pipe, and probably the better part of the afternoon, maybe longer, if I hit more corrosion further down the line. I was halfway through digging out the collapsed section when I heard tires crunching on the gravel behind my house. 2 police officers stepped out of a patrol car, one older, with gray at his temples, the other younger, maybe 30, hand resting near his belt out of habit rather than actual concern. "Mr. Sanders," the older officer called out, "we got a call about a water service dispute." "That's me," I said, straightening up, wiping mud off my palms onto my jeans. "Mainline cracked. I'm mid-repair." The younger officer glanced toward the front of the property, where I could already see Karen's car pulling back in, along with 2 more vehicles behind her. Word had apparently spread fast. My phone, sitting on the porch railing, buzzed twice, then a third time. I didn't check it yet. "Ma'am here says you shut off water deliberately to punish the neighborhood over a property dispute," the younger officer said. "That's not accurate," I said. "I shut it off because the pipe is failing. If I don't fix it now, it fails completely, and then nobody gets water for a lot longer than 1 day." Karen came marching up the driveway before I'd even finished the sentence. 2 more residents in tow, phones already raised, recording, "There he is. Ask him how long he's known about this so-called leak. Ask him if this is really about a pipe, or if he's just trying to strong-arm this community over some grudge he's held for years." That stung, mostly because it was so far from true it almost knocked the wind out of me. I'd never held a grudge against a single person in that neighborhood. I'd let them use my water for over 2 decades without asking for a dime. "Ma'am," the older officer said, turning to Karen, "we're not here to settle a property dispute. That's a civil matter, not a police matter." "Then make him turn the water back on," Karen snapped. "That's not a civil matter. That's 60 families with no water." The younger officer looked at me uncertain. "Sir, is there any way you could restore water temporarily while this gets sorted out?" I set down my shovel and looked him dead in the eye. "If I open that valve right now with a 4-inch crack still exposed, I'll flood my own field, undermine my foundation, and possibly contaminate the line with runoff. I'm not doing that. Not for anyone." Karen's voice rose another notch. "Do you hear yourself? People are more important than your yard, Mr. Sanders. People are more important than my yard," I said quietly. "But nobody's more important than the truth, and the truth is that pipe isn't community property. It never has been." A murmur rippled through the small crowd that had gathered at the edge of my driveway. One neighbor, an older man I recognized vaguely from years of nodding hello at the mailbox, spoke up hesitantly. "Wait, is that true? I thought the HOA owned that line." Karen spun toward him. "Don't listen to him, Frank. He's just trying to confuse the issue." But I could see it in Frank's eyes, and in a few others standing behind him. A small crack of doubt had opened the same kind I'd seen flicker across Karen's face on my porch an hour earlier. It was small, but it was there. Meanwhile, my phone kept buzzing. A neighbor I'd never met had already posted a video to the community group captioned something about a stubborn old man holding the whole neighborhood hostage. Comments were piling up fast, most of them harsh, a few oddly defensive of me from people I didn't recognize. The older officer pulled Karen aside, speaking low enough that I couldn't fully hear, though I caught fragments. Something about jurisdiction. Something about needing documentation before anyone could compel a private landowner to do anything with his own infrastructure. Karen's face went from red to something closer to pale as she listened. When she turned back around, her voice had lost some of its earlier fire, replaced by something tighter, more calculated. "Fine, fine. But I want proof, Mr. Sanders. Real proof, not just your word. Because if you can't show this pipe is yours, I promise you this isn't over." "It's not your word against mine," I said. "It's paperwork against paperwork. And mine's been sitting in a filing cabinet since 1998, filed with the county, stamped and dated long before Millbrook Estates ever poured a single foundation." For the first time since she'd knocked on my door that morning, Karen didn't have an immediate response. She just stood there, arms crossed, jaw working, while the small crowd behind her waited to see what would happen next. And somewhere behind her, Frank quietly stepped a little further from her side. I set my shovel against the fence post and walked inside, leaving the crowd murmuring in my driveway. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that used to feel lonely after Carol passed, but that morning, it felt more like a held breath. I went straight to the hallway closet, past the coats we never wore, to the gray filing cabinet in the back corner. Carol had always been the organized one. She'd labeled every folder in her neat, looping handwriting, and even 4 years after her passing, the system still worked exactly the way she'd left it. I flipped past tax records, past the deed to the house, until my fingers landed on a thick folder, marked simply Waterline 1998. Inside was everything. The original county permit stamped and signed by the Water Authority, a surveyor's map showing the easement running the full length of my property, my name printed clearly at the bottom. A handwritten letter from the developer dated 6 years after I'd laid the pipe, formally requesting a temporary tap-in agreement, my signature at the bottom, granting permission with a clause stating the arrangement could be revoked with reasonable notice. I stood there for a moment holding paper that had waited patiently for over 2 decades to matter again. Carol used to keep this folder close, half joking that someday somebody would try to take what wasn't theirs, and we'd be glad we kept the proof. I hadn't believed her back then. I believed her now. I carried the folder back outside the crowd, still gathered, phones still recording, Karen still standing with her arms crossed, like a woman bracing for a blow she didn't yet know was coming. "You wanted proof," I said, holding up the folder. "Here it is." I opened it on the hood of my truck, laying the documents out one by one, where anyone could see them. The permit, the survey, the letter with the developer's own signature requesting permission from me acknowledging in writing that the line belonged to Walter Sanders, not to any homeowners association that wouldn't exist for another 6 years. Karen stepped closer, her eyes scanning the pages, her expression shifting in real time, from irritation to confusion to something that looked almost like fear. This can't be right. Our HOA handbook lists this as shared infrastructure." "Your handbook is wrong," I said, "because whoever wrote it never checked the county records. This pipe was mine before Millbrook Estates existed. Your developer knew it. He asked my permission, in writing." The older officer leaned over the hood, reading the permit carefully, then glanced up at Karen. "Ma'am, this looks legitimate. County stamp recorder seal dated well before your development broke ground." Frank, still standing near the back of the crowd, let out a low whistle. "Karen, he's not lying. My uncle worked the Water Authority back then. I remember him mentioning a private line out this way." The mood of the crowd shifted, subtle but unmistakable, like a held note finally resolving into a different chord. A few residents who'd been filming Karen moments earlier now turned their phones toward the documents spread across my truck instead. Karen's composure cracked for the first time all day. "Even if that's true, you still can't just cut off water to 60 families without proper notice." "I gave notice," I said, "same as I've given every year for over 2 decades out of courtesy, not obligation. That courtesy is the only reason your community's had free water for 22 years in the first place." That last part landed hard. I watched it land, Karen do the math in real time, watched her realize that the very water she'd been defending so fiercely had never cost her HOA a single dime, all because of a favor I'd extended, and she'd never once questioned. I thought about the iron valve wheel sitting cool in the back field, waiting for repair. No longer just a piece of old hardware, but proof of exactly who held the real power here all along. Not the woman with the loudest voice, not the board with the thickest bylaws, just an old plumber, a filing cabinet, and the truth, patient as ever, waiting for the right moment to surface. The documents on my truck hood settled the argument for the moment, but I knew a moment wasn't enough. Karen had backed down in front of a crowd, but people like her rarely stay quiet for long. If I wanted this handled properly, I needed more than a folder pulled out during an argument. I needed a paper trail nobody could dispute later, filed the right way through the right channels. That afternoon, once the crowd had dispersed, and the officers had left with copies of my permit for their report, I drove into town to the county recorder's office. I'd been there exactly twice before in my life, once to file the original permit, once to record the deed after Carol and I bought the land. The clerk behind the counter, a younger woman with a name tag that read Priya, pulled up my file within minutes. "Everything's still active," she said, scrolling through her screen. Easement recorded, 1998, Book 41, page 212. You want certified copies? 3 sets, I said. And I need to know if there's any record of a transfer, anything showing this line was ever signed over to the Millbrook Estates HOA. She typed for a moment, frowned slightly, then shook her head. Nothing here. No transfer, no deed amendment, no easement modification. As far as the county's concerned, this line has belonged to Walter Sanders since December of 1998. Full stop. I asked her to print that to a formal statement confirming no transfer had ever occurred. She stamped each page with the county seal, signed her name at the bottom, and slid the stack across the counter. I stood there for a second longer than I needed to, feeling the weight of paper that had just turned an argument into a fact. From the recorder's office, I drove straight to a lawyer's office downtown. A small practice run by a man named Elias Cho, who'd handled Carol's estate paperwork years earlier. He listened to the whole story without interrupting, flipping through my folder as I talked, nodding slowly at each document. "You're on solid ground," he said finally. "Better than solid. You've got a permitted easement, an original tap-in request signed by the developer himself, and now a county confirmation that no transfer ever occurred. Legally, you never had an obligation to provide continuous service. You did it as a courtesy, and courtesies can end." "I don't want to just cut them off," I said. "I want this documented properly. I want a formal notice, something that puts everyone on record, so nobody can twist this into me being the villain." Elias nodded and got to work. Within the hour, his office had drafted a formal notice addressed to the Millbrook Estates Homeowners Association Board, citing the recorded easement, referencing the original tap-in agreement, and outlining terms under which water service could be restored. The notice specified a 72-hour timeline for the HOA to formally acknowledge private ownership of the line in writing, along with a proposed usage agreement covering maintenance costs going forward, split according to actual water usage, rather than an arbitrary flat rate. Elias printed the letter on his firm's letterhead, signed it, and had his assistant prepare it for certified mail. The kind that requires a signature on delivery. The kind that leaves no room for anyone to later claim they never received it. I watched the assistant fill out the green delivery slip by hand, tracking number printed in the corner, addressed directly to the HOA's registered agent. "This creates a clean record," Elias said, handing me a copy for my own files. "If this ever ends up in front of a judge, there won't be any ambiguity about who knew what or when." 2 days later, the notice arrived at the HOA's management office. I know because Elias's office received the delivery confirmation the same afternoon, a small printed receipt showing the exact date, time, and the name of the person who signed for it. He forwarded me a copy immediately, the kind of quiet, unglamorous proof that mattered more than any argument shouted in a driveway. I also mailed a second copy directly to every mailbox along my side of the property line, a plain one-page summary explaining the situation, in simple terms the county records, the timeline for repair, and my intention to restore water as soon as the pipe was safely patched. I wasn't trying to win a public relations war, I just wanted my neighbors to have the facts straight from the source before rumors filled in the gaps. By that evening, my phone had gone quiet in a different way than before. Fewer angry calls, more curious ones. A woman named Denise, who lived 2 houses down, called just to say she appreciated me being upfront about everything. An older man I didn't recognize left a voicemail asking if there was anything he could do to help speed up the repair. I sat at my kitchen table that night, the certified mail receipt and the county documents spread out in front of me, and felt something I hadn't expected to feel in the middle of all this. Not vindication exactly, something quieter. The simple, steady comfort of doing something the right way on the record with nothing left to argument or memory. But I also knew paper alone wouldn't end this. Karen wasn't the type to let something go just because the facts weren't on her side. Somewhere out there, she was already talking to someone already planning her next move. And 2 days later, I found out exactly what that move was going to be. By Thursday morning, the Millbrook Estates community page had turned into something I barely recognized. What started as a thread about water service updates had exploded into nearly 200 comments, arguments splitting off into their own smaller threads, Neighbors I'd waved to for years, suddenly arguing with each other over a dispute that had nothing to do with them personally. Someone had posted a blurry photo of me from the driveway confrontation, captioned, "The man holding our water hostage." Another comment beneath it claimed I'd been hoarding the water line for years, specifically so I could pull a stunt like this someday. None of it was true, but truth rarely slows down a rumor once it's picked up speed. Karen, for her part, had gone quiet on the page itself, but I heard secondhand that she was making calls telling select board members and a few longtime residents a different version of events, one where I'd conveniently forgotten to mention any permits until I'd been caught trying to extort the community for money. Denise, the neighbor who'd called me a few nights earlier, sent me a screenshot of a group text Karen had sent to a smaller circle of residents. It read, in part, that I was clearly trying to leverage a technicality, and that the HOA's lawyers would make quick work of some backyard plumber's paperwork. I read that message twice, feeling something between anger and disbelief. I hadn't asked for a dime. I'd only asked to be treated fairly on my own land. Not everyone believed Karen's version, though. Frank, who'd spoken up in my driveway, started replying directly on the community page, correcting misinformation point by point, citing what his uncle had told him about the original Water Authority records. A retired schoolteacher named Margaret, who lived at the far end of the street, posted a long, measured comment, reminding everyone that I'd provided free water access to the entire neighborhood for over 2 decades without complaint, and that maybe gratitude was owed before outrage. Denise became something of a quiet ally too, calling me every evening just to keep me updated on what was circulating, careful never to stir things up further, just making sure I wasn't blindsided by whatever Karen tried next. "She's rattled," Denise told me one night. "People are starting to ask her questions she doesn't want to answer. That's usually when someone like her gets loud." She was right. 2 days later, a notice went up, announcing an emergency HOA meeting open to all residents to address concerns regarding water service disruption and property boundary disputes. The flyer, posted at the clubhouse and emailed to every household, was signed by Karen herself, framing the meeting as necessary to protect community interests against what it vaguely called unresolved infrastructure claims. I understood immediately what she was doing. She wasn't calling this meeting to resolve anything peacefully. She was building a stage 1 where she could stand in front of the whole neighborhood and try to paint me as the villain one more time, hoping numbers and outrage might succeed where paperwork had already failed her. Elias, when I called to tell him about the meeting, wasn't surprised either. "That's actually good for you," he said. "A public meeting means a public record. Bring your documents. Let her make her case in front of everyone, and then you make yours." I sat on my porch that evening, looking out over the field where the pipe still lay half-repaired, waiting for its final patch. Frank had texted earlier, offering to help dig the last section over the weekend. Margaret had left a voicemail, saying she'd be at the meeting, and that she wasn't the only one. For the first time since Karen had pounded on my door that Tuesday morning, I didn't feel like a man under siege. I felt like a man with the truth on his side, walking calmly toward a room full of people who were finally ready to hear it. The Millbrook Estates clubhouse was packed by 7 o'clock. Folding chairs lined up in uneven rows, every seat filled, and a dozen more people standing along the back wall. I'd never seen this many residents in one room before, not even at the summer barbecue the HOA threw every June. Word travels fast when there's a fight to watch, and by the look of the parking lot outside, it seemed like half the neighborhood had shown up early just to get a seat. I sat near the front to the folder of documents resting on my knee. Elias beside me in a plain gray suit, his own briefcase tucked under his chair. Karen stood at the podium up front, flipping through a stack of index cards, her 2 board members seated at a table beside her, like a tribunal, waiting to pass judgment. I noticed her hands weren't quite steady as she squared the cards against the podium, one small tell that the confidence from earlier in the week hadn't fully survived the last 2 days. She tapped the microphone twice, and the room slowly quieted, chairs creaking, a baby fussing somewhere near the back before being hushed. "Thank you all for coming on short notice," Karen began, her voice smooth, rehearsed, nothing like the sharp edge I'd heard on my porch days earlier. As most of you know, this week our community experienced an unprecedented disruption to essential water service caused by Mr. Sanders' unilateral decision to shut off the main line without proper HOA approval. A murmur rippled through the crowd. She continued laying out a timeline that framed me as reckless, careless, indifferent to families with young children and elderly parents. She mentioned nothing about the crack in the pipe, nothing about the notice I'd posted, nothing about the 22 years of free water her community had enjoyed without ever paying a cent. She spoke for nearly 5 minutes, painting a picture of a stubborn old man who'd inconvenienced 60 families over what she called a personal grudge dressed up as a plumbing emergency. Tonight, she said, the board is proposing a formal resolution declaring the waterline under dispute as shared community infrastructure to be managed and maintained under HOA oversight going forward, regardless of any private claims to the contrary. She sat down to a mixture of applause and uneasy silence. I felt Elias's hand rest briefly on my arm. "Your turn," he said quietly. I stood folder in hand and walked to the podium, aware of every eye in the room following me. The room went quiet in a different way this time. Not hostile exactly, more curious, waiting to see what the man from the driveway confrontation actually had to say when he wasn't being shouted at. "My name is Walter Sanders," I began. "Most of you know me as the guy at the end of the street who keeps to himself. Some of you know me now as the man who apparently held your water hostage this week." A few uncomfortable chuckles moved through the room, breaking some of the tension. "I want to walk you through what actually happened, and then I want to show you something." I laid out the timeline plainly the way I'd rehearsed it in my head a dozen times over the past 2 days. The crack I'd found in the pipe, 4 inches long, corroded from the inside. The notice I'd posted 3 days in advance, the same courtesy I'd extended every year for over 2 decades without a single complaint until now. The confrontation on my porch where I was accused of holding a grudge I'd never held, threatened with arrest for repairing infrastructure sitting entirely on my own land. "But here's what matters most tonight," I said, opening the folder. "This pipe isn't community infrastructure. It never has been, not for one single day." I held up the county permit, the survey map, the tap-in agreement signed by the original developer, and finally the letter from the county recorder confirming no transfer of ownership had ever occurred. I passed copies down each row, watching them travel hand to hand through the crowd, watching expressions shift as people actually read the dates, the seals, the signatures for themselves, instead of relying on rumors from a community page. In 1998, I dug this line myself, on my own property years before this development existed. When Millbrook was built, the developer asked my permission for a temporary connection. I said yes. That agreement never expired because I never revoked it. Not because I had to keep it going, because I chose to every single year as a neighbor out of nothing but goodwill. Karen shifted in her seat, her composure tightening visibly. "This doesn't change the fact that shutting off water without 30 days' notice violated community expectations, regardless of who technically owns the pipe. There's no bylaw that governs private infrastructure on private land," Elias said, standing beside me, now his voice calm and precise, the kind of voice that made people lean in rather than argue back. "I've reviewed your HOA's governing documents in full, cover to cover. Nowhere does it list this line as HOA property. Nowhere does it establish jurisdiction over emergency repairs conducted by a private landowner. Mr. Sanders was under no legal obligation to provide any notice at all, let alone 30 days. A man near the back stood up, one of the residents I didn't recognize by name. "Then why'd he give notice in the first place if he didn't have to?" I answered before Elias could, the question landing exactly where I wanted it to. "Because that's what decent neighbors do. I've given free water to this entire community for 22 years without asking for anything back. Not a dime, not a favor, nothing. I gave notice out of courtesy, not obligation. And this week, that courtesy got me threatened with arrest on my own front porch, in front of my own house, by people who never once bothered to check who actually owned that pipe." The room went quiet. A different kind of quiet than before, heavier, more thoughtful. I could see it settling over people's faces, the realization spreading row by row, the same way doubt had first crept across Frank's expression days earlier in my driveway. Karen tried again, her voice sharper now, less rehearsed, more defensive. Regardless of history, the board believes community water access shouldn't rest permanently in the hands of one individual, who could at any point decide to cut it off again without warning. You're right, I said. It shouldn't rest entirely in one person's hands, which is why I'm proposing something different tonight, something better than a resolution that just takes what isn't yours. I nodded to Elias, who pulled a document from his briefcase and handed copies to the board table, and to the two officers he'd invited to attend as neutral witnesses. Mr. Sanders is offering the HOA a formal permanent easement agreement, granting continued water access under a documented maintenance sharing arrangement, with costs split according to actual usage reviewed annually and administered jointly between both parties. In exchange, the HOA formally acknowledges Mr. Sanders' ownership of the line and agrees that any future repairs affecting service will follow a reasonable notice protocol mutually agreed upon in writing. Frank stood up near the back, his voice carrying easily across the quiet room. That sounds more than fair to me. Better than fair, honestly, considering he's been giving us free water for over 20 years and got yelled at for it in front of his own house. Margaret rose next, her voice steady, the voice of someone who'd taught classrooms for 30 years and knew how to hold a room's attention. I think we owe Mr. Sanders an apology, not a resolution, stripping him of something that's rightfully his. I've lived here 12 years. Not once did I know how this water actually got to my tap. Applause started scattered at first, then gathering across the room, chairs creaking as more people stood. Karen sat frozen at the table, flipping through the agreement Elias had handed her earlier, fire visibly draining away as she read line after line of terms that were objectively generous, far more generous than anything the board had offered. She looked up, finally meeting my eyes across the room. For a moment, neither of us said anything, the applause slowly settling back into silence. I owe you an apology, she said quietly, though the microphone still caught it clearly. I said things I shouldn't have said. I threatened you with something I had no right to threaten you with, and I did it in front of your own home, in front of your own neighbors, without checking a single fact first. I nodded slowly. Apology accepted. But this was never about who's more right, Karen. It was about respect. You didn't ask a single question before you started shouting. If you had, we wouldn't have needed a room full of people to sort this out for us. The board voted that night, unanimous, to accept the easement agreement as written. Karen herself made the motion, her voice steadier now stripped of the performance that had opened the meeting. As the room began to break into smaller conversations, Frank came up and shook my hand firmly, and Margaret hugged me before I even realized she was moving toward me, her eyes a little wet. Whether you like it or not, the truth doesn't care how loud you shout over it. It just waits patient as ever for the moment someone's finally ready to listen. The following Saturday, Frank showed up at 7 in the morning, with a shovel over his shoulder and a thermos of coffee in his other hand. Figured you could use a second set of hands, he said, nodding toward the back field where the final section of pipe still needed patching before I could fully restore pressure. We worked through the morning together, mostly in comfortable silence, the kind two men fall into when the talking's already been done, and all that's left is the labor. Around noon, 2 more neighbors showed up unannounced, a young couple named the Reyes, carrying sandwiches and a cooler of water bottles, insisting on helping haul the old sections of cracked pipe to my truck bed. We wanted to do something, Mrs. Reyes said, a little sheepish. We were part of the crowd that first day. We didn't know the whole story then. By early afternoon, the new coupling was set, the trench backfilled, and I walked to the front of the property, gloves still caked in dirt, and turned the old iron valve wheel of full rotation. Water rushed back through the line with a low hiss, then steadied into a smooth, even flow. A small cheer went up from the handful of neighbors who'd gathered to watch. Phones out again, but recording something different this time. 3 days later, Elias called to confirm the paperwork had been finalized. The HOA board formally signed the easement agreement at their regular monthly meeting. No drama this time, no raised voices, just signatures on a document that spelled out in plain language exactly what belonged to whom and what each side owed the other going forward. A copy was filed with the county, right alongside the original 1998 permit, closing a loop that had been left dangerously open for over 2 decades. The agreement itself was simple but thorough. Water usage would be metered and reviewed annually, with maintenance costs split proportionally between my household and the HOA based on actual consumption. Any future repairs requiring service interruption would require 72 hours notice, posted both at the community gate and sent electronically to all residents, a system Denise volunteered to help manage since she already ran the neighborhood email list. Karen, to her credit, didn't disappear or resign in embarrassment the way some people might have. Instead, she showed up at my door the following week, this time without board members flanking her, just her, holding a small potted plant in an envelope. "I wanted to bring this by myself," she said, holding out the plant somewhat awkwardly. "It's not much, I just wanted you to know the apology wasn't only for that meeting. It was for how I treated you that first morning before I knew anything." I took the plant, some kind of small flowering shrub, and set it on the porch railing near where Carol's old wind chime still hung. "Appreciated," I said. "Come in for coffee." She hesitated, then nodded. We sat at my kitchen table for the better part of an hour, talking through logistics for the new agreement, but also just talking the way neighbors probably should have been doing for the past 2 decades, instead of assuming things about each other from a distance. She told me she'd moved to Millbrook after a difficult divorce and thrown herself into the HOA board, partly to feel like she had control over something in her life again. It didn't excuse how she'd treated me that first morning, but it helped me understand it. Before she left, she asked if the HOA could organize a small community workday each spring, volunteers helping maintain the easement area together as a gesture of goodwill and shared responsibility, rather than leaving the burden entirely on me. I told her that sounded like exactly the kind of thing Carol would have loved. 2 weeks after the meeting, the water ran steady through every tap in Millbrook Estates, the pipe fully repaired, the paperwork fully settled, the fences mended in more ways than one. Frank started stopping by most weekends just to talk, sometimes bringing his kids along to see the old valve wheel, telling them the story of the pipe that started a whole neighborhood drama, already turning it into local legend. I still walk the property line every morning, same as always, checking fence posts and drainage ditches, out of habit. But now, when I pass the valve, I don't feel the need to prove anything to anyone. The paperwork settled that a long time ago. What settled everything else in the end wasn't a document at all. It was 2 people finally sitting down at a kitchen table, willing to listen. It's been 3 months now since that Tuesday morning, when Karen pounded on my door, demanding I turn the water back on before the police arrived. Some evenings I still sit on the porch where it all started, watching the oak tree Carol planted cast long shadows across the yard, listening to water moving quietly through a pipe that almost tore this whole neighborhood apart. I think about that morning often, not with anger anymore, but with a kind of tired understanding. Karen wasn't a villain in the way the community page painted her that first week. She was scared, overwhelmed, reacting to a crisis the only way she knew how, loud and certain, without pausing to ask a single question first. I understand that impulse better than I'd like to admit. Grief does strange things to people. So does the fear of losing control over something you've built. What this whole ordeal taught me more than anything is that the truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. It just needs someone patient enough to lay it out clearly, and a room full of people willing to actually listen instead of just reacting. For 22 years, I let a piece of paper sit quietly in a filing cabinet, never imagining I'd need it. But when the moment came, it spoke louder than any argument I could have made standing on my porch. I think about Carol a lot these days, too, more than usual. She always said peace was worth more than principle, but she also kept that folder labeled and ready, just in case peace ever needed defending. I understand now that those 2 things aren't opposites. Sometimes protecting peace means being ready to stand your ground calmly with facts instead of fists, until the people around you remember what fairness actually looks like. Millbrook Estates held its first community workday last month. Frank brought his kids. Margaret brought lemonade the same way Carol used to. Karen showed up too, sleeves rolled up, helping clear brush along the easement without anyone needing to ask her twice. It wasn't a grand reconciliation, just neighbors doing ordinary work together, which somehow felt like exactly the right ending. If there's one thing I hope you take from this story, it's this. Before you raise your voice at someone, ask one question first. You might be surprised what you learn. And if you're the one being shouted at, hold your ground with facts, not fury. The truth has a way of outlasting anger, every single time. So Karen never actually turned that pipe off. Walter Sanders did. And that one detail is the whole story right there. Walter didn't win because he yelled louder or had a flashier lawyer. He won because 22 years earlier, a young plumber filed a permit he never thought he'd need again, then kept that folder labeled and ready because his wife Carol told him someday somebody might try to take what wasn't theirs. That's the part people miss. Real power isn't the loudest voice in the driveway. It's the paperwork sitting quiet in a filing cabinet for 2 decades, waiting for the day it finally matters. Karen had volume. Walter had a permit stamped in 1998. Only one of those holds up in a county recorder's office. Most of us aren't sitting on a private water main, but how many of you have got something in a drawer right now? An old deed, a contract, an easement that you completely forgot about. This story's your reminder to go dig it out. If you were in that clubhouse meeting when the county letter got passed down the row, what would you have been thinking? Drop it in the comments. If Walter reminded you that quiet preparation beats loud panic hit, like, share this with someone dealing with their own HOA headache, and subscribe for more stories like his, because the truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs someone patient enough to file it and brave enough to lay it on the table when it counts.